People with ideas to reduce negative globalisation effects are not always politicians, funny enough. I'm not sure if you've heard of the book Utopia for Realists, but it's an excellent read written by a Dutch author, R. Bregman, and he radically advocates open country borders and a universal income for everyone, rich or poor. This idea has been lobbied in politics for the last 10 years, and it is really gaining momentum, and more prominent people are beginning to speak about it. For example, Yuval Hariri, who is a Jewish intellectual from Jerusalem. The French economist Thomas Piketty wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century, which was published in 2014. It's a huge book, and it's based on 12 years collaborative research, but it proposes converging inequality around the world by introducing a very small tax on capital of high net worth individuals who have often inherited money. He also proposes abolishing tax havens, which is how multinational corporations have used to expedite their wealth through aggressive tax avoidance. You've probably heard a lot about this in the news and also on social media. Offshore tax havens actually enable the parking of capital in the billions from multinationals, and a lot of high net worth individuals do the same, hiding their capital from governments, which of course lowers government's income in tax. When the lower and the middle classes struggle, as they have done through the crisis years, it's an understandable reaction that they get angry about this, and it's almost predictable to forecast that the average citizen will then blame their losses either on uncaring politicians or immigrants for their own declining financial status. However, there's a lot more to the picture, and multinational tax avoidance and high net worth individuals who hide their money are also part of the problem. So looking at financial inequality and classes, is financial inequality a myth? Of course, many right-wing politicians or far right-wing minded Republicans will tell you that we're all born equal and everybody has the opportunity to become, for example, the President of America. This is sold as a big idea in the States. But when you think about it, President Trump, I mean, he's a billionaire. He inherited $100 million from his father. So he's barely like the guy who's made the American dream come true. The French economics professor Thomas Piketty doesn't think that inequality is a myth. In his years of collective research on inequality, which led to the publishing of this book, Capital in the 21st Century, he shows the historical convergence and divergence of inequality using all the world data available to date. His final conclusion is an equation which says R is greater than G, which basically just says that the mechanisms of current wealth concentration results in a far greater return on private capital, for example, shareholders of these multinationals, than the return on sovereign GDP of individual governments. Piketty actually assesses also how inequality is created, explains the dangers to society, and I could definitely think we're living in one of those dangers right now where we have some highly questionable leaders, and also how inequality stagnates the purchasing power of lower and middle classes, which is why, of course, so many people are angry and have done some strange voting to say, well, how else could I describe it? It's strange. As an economist, Piketty does not agree with right-wing politicians who believe that we can rely on the market economy to decrease inequality. And instead, he proposes levying a marginally tiny tax on high net worth individuals, and it would be something like 0.001. And yet, of course, the right wing have managed to push Piketty into silence, and it's only really the left wing that are talking much about Thomas Piketty. But he's definitely interesting to look up, find some YouTube videos on him, and I think you'll enjoy his views on society as well. Politically conservative right-wing audiences prefer as little government interference as possible, and they justify their non-taxation of shareholders or big multinationals, and they blame inequality only on salary differences. Yet Thomas Piketty's calculations show how the central banks, including the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and Bank of England's balance sheets have expanded since 2008 to between 15 and 20% of GDP, which is modest when compared with net private wealth, which is 500 to 600% higher in most of the rich countries. That's taken from Piketty's book, so that's a quote. But that's a huge difference. So governments have managed to survive the crisis, and we're only 20% of GDP higher than in 2008. But rich individuals and shareholders and multinationals are 500 to 600% higher. So they really haven't felt the crisis. Financial deregulation in the past 25 years began in the UK under Thatcher's conservative liberalism, abolishing the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and investment banking. The financial world basically took off like a runaway horse, which led eventually to the financial fragility which we saw in 2008, where the once unthinkable collapse of the investment bank Lehman Brothers became a reality. This lack of regulation assisted the world crisis. And I mean, we know that many bankers' obsessions with bonuses basically wiped out ethical standards, barely conscious or aware of the rest of society. And they created all these financially risky products such as CDSs, which are credit default swaps, quite technical, I won't explain them, and synthetically secured CDOs, credit debt obligations. It was all basically built on a house of cards which was bound to fail. Globalization without regulation and rising commodity prices does lead to inequality if there's no regulation, and this counteracts its positive effects. Many studies also show that gains from free trade come from the diffusion of knowledge and from productivity gain made necessary by open borders. Piketty says that countries have benefited from open markets for goods, services, and terms of trade from free capital flows. However, increased stable legal frameworks together with increasing technological know-how are needed to help get rid of inequality. Since the early 19th century, many liberal politicians have opposed social or labor legislation changes in politics. They claim that inequality is due to natural differences in physical, intellectual, and moral capabilities. But Piketty explains that this argument is just used as a convenient principle to defend the privileges of the winners without explaining why the changes in equality follow the curves and causes that he observed through his research. For example, inherited wealth worldwide, illustrated from 1970 to 2010 in Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, shows that in 2010, public capital was worth 20% of national income versus over 400% for private capital from the wealthy. The problem, he states, is that in the new global economy, the price system of goods and properties knows neither limits nor morality. Right, I keep these short so that you can just re-listen and they don't take too much time. But it is time to end. And to just summarize, so inequality is not a myth, it exists. I think this is the reason why a lot of people in the middle and lower classes are unhappy. In the future with robots, we might just all need a universal income. The Jewish intellectual I was telling you about, he thinks that we'll just spend time sitting at home playing video games. We'll definitely need a more creative future, that's for sure. We also spoke about growing inequality, why it grows because of R being greater than G, this rate of return on capital of wealthy individuals who've often inherited money. So, are we all equal? Of course, spiritually we are, but in the material world, unfortunately, we just aren't. And next time, I'd like to finish up on globalization and just have a little bit of a look at history, colonialization, and just tie up any loose ends before we move into the next section, which will be more based on societies and families. Hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time.